Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. This is show 195. We have a great guest on tonight, a friend of the show. I'll introduce him in a few seconds. But first of all, I want to talk about how this has been a great day for British democracy, another great day for British democracy. We find out, for example, that the Speaker of the House of Commons, who is there to provide legal and moral guidance for the unruly bunch of 600 and odd MPs, in fact, has been squandering taxpayers' money on freebies and five-star hotels and travelling first class all over the place. Some example, some house. It's been an interesting day too for Keir Starmer. He may or may not be aware of this, but he was lampooned on the Jon Stewart show on American television last night. Jon Stewart decided that he would take a look at the performance of the two leaders who met with Trump recently. And the two he selected were Zelensky from Ukraine and Starmer from the UK. Of course, as you know, Zelensky's put up a spirited defence of his nation. In contrast, Starmer reached into a pocket and produced an invitation, which he then implored the president to read. Jon Stewart showed this and said to his million strong audience, he made out that Starmer was an onanist, and he made the sign of masturbation, which is a good way of summing up the approach that Starmer took to Trump. These are interesting times. You can't help but feel concerned for Canada right now, because Trump has announced that he's placing tariffs on the Canadians and on the Mexicans. Primarily, his excuse was at the get-go that this was because of fentanyl, i.e. that enormous amounts of fentanyl drugs were flowing across the respective borders of Canada and Mexico. There are only two small problems there. One is that the amount of fentanyl crossing from Canada is not thousands of tons. In fact, it's 26 tons maximum over a number of years. And in the case of Mexico, every single person who's been found with fentanyl is an American citizen. So you might think that one would start looking at home before looking elsewhere. And the Canadians have put up, unlike Keir Starmer, a spirited defence of their nation. And some of the videos featuring the Prime Minister, or as the Trump people call him, the Governor of Canada, are very impressive. But it's very confusing, because not just for the Canadians, but for others, including many millions of Americans who, for the last 50, 60 years have been fed a diet that in fact, America's main enemy, foe, opponent in the world is the Soviet Union and Russia, which was painted as a so-called red menace. And other countries were enlisted by United States governments of various hues, Democrat and Republican, to help them fight against this red menace, only to discover, as of Trump's re-election, that in fact they are the menace. And the good guys are Russia. Well, that takes some getting used to. And we're all going to, I suspect, find our lives hugely disrupted as a result of these machinations. Anyway, enough of that. Let's move on to something much more enlightening and engaging. It's my great pleasure to welcome back William Thomson. We're going to talk about Scotonomics and the Festival of Economics. Hi, William. How are you?
Hello, John. Very nice to see you. Are you well?
I'm exceptionally well. How are you?
Yep, very well. Been back in Scotland now for 7 or 8 months. We were living in Barcelona, and it's beautiful. It's wonderful to be back.
Yes, you don't miss the climate. You don't miss the sunshine.
Yeah. No, I don't actually. The family do, but I don't. I'm much happier in the slight cold and drizzle.
Tell us a bit about the key themes of the Festival of Economics. We've posted it on the screen here, and people can read it. But it's much more enlightening to hear from you yourself what's involved.
Yeah, well, thanks, John. This is the third year that we've had the festival now, and we're hoping to have a wee bit more profile for it. A lot more attendees. People can attend in person in Dundee or online. The online part's really important for us, just to make sure that as many people as possible can engage with the content. 2 days, Friday from 5 until 10 o'clock, and Saturday from early in the morning through to late in the evening. So it's a lot going on. Last year we had about 25 hours. We extended into the Sunday, and it was too much for everyone, especially me, having to kind of manage this over 3 days. So we took the decision to drop it down a little bit. So we've got about 15, 16 hours in total. I think
That's
that'll
a
be
lot.
I think that's enough for people. Yeah. It's really, you're trying to sum up not just the issues with Scotland's economy, but the global economy. And also we're kind of touching on what a future economy would look like for Scotland if there was a new economic framework in the UK. And also, of course, touching on Scotland as an independent nation as well. So it's a lot to cover in 1.5 days. But I think we do a really good job. And what helps us do that is to have these key themes. And every year we have different key themes. So we've got 4 key themes this year. The first one is this idea of resilience, and you'll see that in the programme. We're going to be looking at Scotland, kind of how does it deal with the next crisis. We need to think about our food sovereignty. We need to think about our energy sovereignty. How do we become much more resilient? And our kind of core position is that as a society, and especially as governments and political parties, we need to start focusing on resilience and not growth. Growth undermines our resilience. Resilience is what we need to concentrate on to have a much fairer and much stronger, much more just economy. So that's a big key theme for us. The second one is this idea that we can just tweak with the system and we'll be able to achieve the types of economy that we want. Everyone talks about a just transition, a well-being economy, and what we're kind of seeing and what we're evidencing over these 1.5 days is to say that actually we need to change the system. We need a paradigm shift for us to be able to achieve this. So when we hear people talking about a just transition and a well-being economy, we are kind of saying with a lot of evidence that we can't do that unless we change the system. For some people, that change of the system might be for independence. For other people, it might not be. So we're really looking at that. But the main point is that we need a substantial change. We've got to stop tweaking around the edges. And the third one is that we really need to start taking an alternative viewpoint of our economy. And I think we're way past the time, and I know we'll touch on this, but I think we're way past the time when conventional mainstream economics can give us the answers to our problems. And that's what's happened for the last 40 years. We've been relying on one particular economic viewpoint to tell us what's happened, what went wrong, and how we fix it. And it's clear to everyone. You just need to look out your window and you can see that this viewpoint, this orthodox, traditional viewpoint is failing everyone. And we need to think about how we start pushing this alternative economics, the discipline of economics and the ideas from alternative economics through to much more and into the mainstream. And then finally, we're talking about the stories that we need to tell. What are the progressive stories? What are the stories that are going to resonate with people? Because we need to start to fight back against these austere stories that we hear from the mainstream. Things like the government's like a household and it can't borrow any money. We need to start thinking of our own stories so we can start tackling these. So we're going to be asking people to tell stories in the presentations and try and that in. So that's the 4 key themes that kind of structures the 2 days.
That's good. Taking this last element about the stories, the theme about the stories, a lot of people be confused just now, William. I mean, you can help work out for them. They were told up until a few weeks ago, in fact, probably less than that, that the reason that the winter fuel allowance had to be abandoned and the reason that the government had to bear down on disadvantaged people and those on benefits is so that the money thereby accrued could be used to keep the country afloat because there was a big black hole, as they put it. All of a sudden, the same people are hearing a different story, which is that we're planning to up our defence spending. And the question they'll be asking themselves is, where's the money come from?
Yeah, well, I think I'll get into the detail, John, but unfortunately, not enough people are asking that question, and we're not asking it firmly enough, because people were asking this question. If we would have had this conversation back in 2020, 21, we would have said, we've got no money, but we've found all this money for COVID.
Yeah.
And if we would have done that 10 years before, we would have said, we've got no money. How did we manage to find trillions of pounds to bail out the banks?
Mm.
So this is a story. This is a question that should be asked every single day. It's never a problem for the government to find money when it wants to spend that money. Right now, the government is choosing not to spend money on the most well, in huge parts of our society, not spending enough money on our health service, on our education, on our social security, on our infrastructure. But now they're deciding to spend more money on defence.
So where did they get this money from?
Just a really important point is,
did they find it down the back of the sofa? Where did it come from?
So the UK government and most governments have something called a fiscal framework or fiscal rules. And they set these rules to say that you can't borrow more, you can't borrow more money than a certain percentage. Now, these rules are just set. It's like me and you just saying, right, okay, let's say a rule of 3%, 5%, 10%. These are just rules that have been set by politicians and economists, and they try and keep to that rule every year. Now, this rule could be completely changed, but this rule is so important that all of our spending decisions must fit within this framework. And effectively, it's the Office for Budget Responsibility who make the decisions on what our elected politicians spend their money on in the grand scheme of things, because our politicians say we have to keep to this framework, and we give it over to economists who are all neoclassically trained. The majority are from private schools, majority are white, majority are men. They all have the same worldview and assumptions that are so different from all of us. And it's them who say to the government, no, you can't spend money on that because you'll break your fiscal framework. So this is a straitjacket that I think it's really important for people to understand.
Given they have accepted the straitjacket, how all of a sudden can they suddenly burst free from its constraints?
Sure. So not only have they accepted it, but they set it. It's absolutely crazy. But the reason that they can break this is because the government creates money without reference to how much it taxes or borrows. And this happens every single day in any country that has its own currency. So right now, the government spends money. It just puts money into the reserve balance accounts at the central bank. This is how government spends all of its money. So if it wants to pay for weapons in Northern Ireland, all it does is it creates currency and it puts them into the bank that the weapons manufacturer in Belfast uses. It just creates currency. But it creates currency every single day. That is how the government spends money. At no point does it collect taxes and then get this amount of tax and then put it into another pot and then spend it. That's not how government finances work. That's the myth and the story that we've been told. And we believe it. And every single decade, there's the clearest example you could possibly imagine where it says, this is not happening. This does not take place. But we still see attempts for the government to frame this as if there's money coming from somewhere. Well, we'll steal money from or we'll hold money for the Russian oligarchs that's deposited in banks, and we'll use that. But these are just kind of smoke and mirrors. If the government wants to increase spending, all it does is put digital currency, type the keyboard, and put more money into a reserve bank account, and then that reserve bank account pays the company, and then the company buys stuff with it. This is how all government financing works. There is a magic money tree. It's called the Bank of England, and it puts money into the bank account. The huge issue is that the structure, the economic framework that we have, only values certain elements of government spending. So we're not spending money on reducing and eliminating poverty, educating kids, building infrastructure. The government is choosing not to do this, and it chooses austerity. It chooses to punish and torture the poorest in society.
Do you think that's because many of the politicians don't really understand economics at all? and they're guided by these stale male white characters who have been brought up in an atmosphere of classical economics, as you put it. In other words, they can't really think through economics for themselves. They're guided entirely by civil servants who come to them and say, you have to work within this. But then, if that is the case, and I'm assuming you're going to say yes to that, how do they possibly explain where this extra money for Ukraine, for example, is going to come from?
Yeah, well, you're right, partly, but I have some sympathy with politicians, because the amount of knowledge that they have to have in a particular area is huge. I've been studying how monetary systems work for 5 years. I'm still learning. So expecting our politicians to properly understand how the monetary system works or how the education system works is really, really challenging. So I do have some sympathy on that point. And I think your point's really clear. If you're not sure, and everyone who's within government, who's within civil services telling you this, and they're the experts, and maybe they've written some really influential papers, or they've been an economist for 40 years, it's really difficult for a politician to say, I don't believe you. This is not how the system works. So I think that's really important. But I want to go back to this. Even if they did want to change it, they can't just start spending money, because there's a fiscal framework, there's fiscal rules that keep it constrained. And these rules are set to ensure that the government doesn't spend as much as it should on the things that we all think it should. The system is rigged, the system is flawed, and it's a system that we need to change. And I think it's just unfortunate sometimes we spend a lot of time criticizing individual politicians rather than exposing the system and understanding the system.
I'm still not clear about how they explain away to themselves, the politicians and the civil servants, since they're steeped in this orthodoxy, right? All of a sudden they decide that they need to junk it for whatever reason it is. Right now it's Ukraine. Previously, as you said, it was COVID. And somehow they're entirely comfortable with that. In other words, we'll do it for COVID, we'll do it for Ukraine, and then we'll go back. You think, why go back then? If you accept it for these reasons, why don't you continue it?
Well, what's happening, John, it's easy for them to defend it, because what they do is they say things like, well, if we're going to put money towards weapons for Ukraine, we've got to cut benefits for the most disadvantaged in our society. So there's always this narrative of taking from something to give somewhere else. So that's how they justify it. And also, they will come up with these accounting tricks that the ONS, the Office for Budget Responsibility, tries to work with the Chancellor to find these ways of fitting expenditure, changing the horizon for a balanced budget. So there's all these kind of fixes. And it's a really important question, John, because it's clear if these were proper scientists, if neoclassical economists were proper scientists, they would look at this system, they would say, oh, actually, the world doesn't work like that. Let's find a way of explaining and understanding the world which is much more close to the real life. And that's the type of economics we cover at the conference. It's the type of economics I've been studying for years. We look at a problem and we find the real world solution. We're not tied to these crazy ideas that a budget deficit's a bad thing, or that price is always the most important factor. We're not stuck to these iron laws like orthodox mainstream economists are. We're much more open to being challenged and challenging the system as it is. So they just justify it within the framework because they're unable to kind of step outside it, or the whole system breaks down. And everyone knows that's what happened in 2008. We all saw that the system, the financial service, the financialization of our economy was so damaging. And economists at that point didn't even have the financial sector in their economic models. They didn't even have money in their economic models, John. And this is not a lie. They didn't need money because they just assumed away money within their models. And this is why it broke. And we're in the same situation again. There's this huge assumption that when a government spends more than it collects in tax, it can destroy an economy. And the exact opposite is true. When governments don't do that, society collapses, governments collapse, and economies flounder.
But there are so many examples of how that heterodox view that view is not accurate. Oh, by the way, we've had a questioner saying, "Can William please give a brief description of heterodoxy?"
Yeah, sure. So We look at the world and we try and see the problems and the solution. We try and see the problems that affect people, and we try and look at the solutions, and we look at them in depth. So we would look at a problem, and rather than say, well, you just simply put the price up and everything will be sorted, or you just tax that and everything will be sorted. And we look at any economic problem that you've got, and we spend a little bit more time on it. We take a much broader perspective. So using psychology, behavioral science, our anthropological studies, as well as economic insights. And we look at a problem and we use a whole wide variety, a suite of tools to try and solve a problem.
Yeah.
So we don't come at it with this understanding that all of these things must be the case. And that allows us to be much more detailed in our response and much more open to the evidence. But at its core, we don't believe in these iron laws. We don't believe that every single person is selfish, that they make every single decision on price, that government involvement in an economy is bad. There's all these assumptions that we don't start with. We look for evidence. And I think that is the main difference between a heterodox and an orthodox perspective. And I'm happier to call myself more of a scientist than an orthodox economist, because I look for evidence and I change my beliefs depending on the evidence. And the orthodoxy, as we all know, and we've seen it for at least since 2008, don't change their assumptions.
It's interesting because how you describe your own approach is pretty close to what happened to FDR in the States. I mean, he was a fiscal conservative. He was elected on that basis. He tried all the measures that fiscal conservatives use, the orthodox economics, they all failed. And then he said, let's just spend money.
Pretty much.
And they built highways all over the US. They started spending money on defense, and all of a sudden, the economy turned around. Now, I know the cynics will say, yeah, but that's because there was a war, and therefore there was a need to spend. But it still doesn't undercut your view, which is that whatever reason is used, conventional economics was junked, and a very different approach was taken.
Yeah. And
he became a hero.
The famous quote from Keynes is that he said, when the evidence changes, I change my opinion. What do you do, sir? Yeah. And it was very much that in the late 30s, it was Keynesianism, John Maynard Keynes's ideas, which created the boom in the economy after the Second World War. Literally the golden period of growth. From the 50s right through to the mid-1970s. And at the time, the type of economics we've got now was the heterodoxy. There was an orthodoxy, which was governments create demand by spending money, and that keeps an economy in a much healthier position. And then after the problems in the 1970s, the heterodox view, which is now the orthodox view, came into place. And this kind of economic liberalism, that we have to reward the wealthy because governments borrow from them, and we have to look after ourselves. It's the only way to look after our society. All these mainstream ideas. So things do change, and that's where I'm at least hopeful, because it was 40 years ago when all the ideas changed. Maybe it's about time that they change to a completely different suite and an understanding of how the economy really works.
And you guys are regarded as the pathfinders, really. So I see you've got people like Andy Verity on the show. Does he believe in conventional orthodox economics?
I think Andy's interviewing three. So he's a BBC economics commentator, and he's interviewing three of our guests. Andy, if you look at all of his stuff on Twitter over the last couple of years, is very supportive of there being more fiscal space for governments than governments admit. Now, I wouldn't say he was in the modern monetary theory camp, which is where I am, but he clearly believes that the government can spend more money. It doesn't collect it in taxes, doesn't need to borrow to spend. So Andy is as close to a modern monetary theory commentator as we have in the mainstream, but he's clearly of the heterodox view. And you only look at the book that he's written. He wrote a book about the financial services industry, and he looked at it in detail. And he looked at the cases and found that there was huge issues with how we run financial services in the UK. So yeah, we're really trying to encourage more people in the mainstream to speak out and to be open to other views. And Andy's one of the good guys at the moment.
You said that government doesn't need to tax people in order to have the income it needs to spend. Is the corollary of that the case then, that government taxes people for reasons of social manipulation?
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. There's lots of reasons that we use tax, and I kind of see tax as being almost like the blood in the economic system. It's absolutely essential. And I'll spend just no more than a minute on this, but if you want a society to function, if you want people to exchange money for goods and services, then there has to be some reason for them to hold that currency. And how you make sure that people hold currency is by having a tax liability associated to that currency. So if you and I are in the same country, we need to use the same currency because we've both got taxes to pay, and we have to pay taxes in the currency of the government. So just that one rule that you have to pay tax makes or allows the whole of our economic society to function. Because if we didn't have to pay tax, then we wouldn't need the currency. And if I don't need the currency, you don't need the currency. How does a modern economic system work? We all have to need the currency and use it. And tax is the best way to ensure that people use the same currency and that it has value. Now, if people understood that, they would realize that actually the tax that they pay is just a way of them supporting a society, a functioning society. If no one paid taxes, and we're kind of straying on the absolute economic madness that's happening in the States at the moment. If you don't, if no one in America pays taxes, no one will want the dollar, because there's no need to have the dollar if you don't pay taxes. So this opens up a whole new world of completely different currencies, which the government doesn't control. And these are things that libertarians might be quite interested in, but these have huge problems for provisioning a state if you don't have your own currency. So taxes are absolutely crucial. And there's other things that taxes do. You put taxes up, and in a lot of instances, it means that you consume less of it. So this is really good for managing a system. One really important thing, and another huge worry for what's happening in the States, is that tax is used to delete money from a system to allow the government to spend more money back into that system. So if you're not deleting the money from taxes, then you can't create or spend any new money. So the government can't spend money on roads and on education and on health and all of these wonderful things it needs to spend money on, because there's too much money in the economy. So tax takes some of that money out. We could have done a whole session or a whole episode on tax, John, but I hope that's useful. It's not collected to be spent. It's collected and it's destroyed. It's an IOU. It's a government IOU. When it's returned, it's destroyed. It doesn't pay for, doesn't function anything. And there's very little discussion or debate around that at that level. People know that government money is an IOU, and all the evidence tells us that it's not used to pay for anything. It's simply destroyed, because that's what happens to all IOUs. When they're given out and when they're returned, the function's over and it's destroyed.
So I want to talk about the national debt in a second, but let me just ask a quick question about the tariffs. Donald Trump is levying tariffs on the Canadians and the Mexicans, as I said earlier. What do you think the effect of those tariffs will be?
Tariffs have always been used, and they're still used today, as a way to build up domestic industry or domestic sectors. And they've been used like that for 250, 300 years. And that's what taxes are being used for in America right now. It's an idea that if something's much more expensive to import, then you'll look for your domestic supplier and you'll buy it from them. And that's what the rationale has always been for tariffs. In the last 100 years, and especially in the last 50 years after we abandoned the gold standard, no one looked at tariffs as a way to raise revenue. It's one of the most ridiculous economic ideas that you use taxation, that you use tariffs to pay for anything. And one of the reasons I've already alluded to is that you need taxes in your domestic economy to clear space for government spending, although Trump clearly doesn't want the government to spend any money, but you need taxes to remove demand, or there'll be loads of inflation, which there is absolutely bound to be in America. So at its core, the message that it's about raising revenue is just not true. It's not feasible. All taxes paid, all tariffs paid, the tax paid on tariffs have to come from the American financial system. You can only pay a tax to the US government by having access to a reserve balance, a reserve account at the Federal Reserve Bank. So the American government only collect tax from bank accounts in the American system. So this idea that someone's sending the government a check from China or Japan or the UK for dollars is absolute nonsense. Every single dollar, unless it's taken out in a suitcase, exists in the American financial services sector. So it's just crazy, mad economics. And your wider question, tariffs will very likely cause large inflation, but that'll be amplified because of all the other crazy things that are happening in the American economy. But one thing I want to make it clear is that there's a plutocracy in America right now, and everyone who's in a position of power is trying to gain as much in material and financial wealth as possible. And that's the rationale for all of this. Don't look at economic narratives. This is about theft. This is a plutocracy. And when you take the economics out of it, it becomes really, really obvious. And my final point here, John, is that everyone would always think that when an economy is growing, when GDP is rising, that everyone's better off. And all the evidence suggests that when GDP rises, the richest become better off. And what we're going to see in America over the next hopefully only 4 or 5 years, is when GDP shrinks, the wealthiest become better off. So using GDP as any kind of guide, as any kind of direction for how you manage your economy is clearly a huge issue. All it does is allow the wealthiest society to gain more of the material and the financial wealth that we have.
It's interesting because I watched a car dealer outside his dealership in the States, in the Midwest, being interviewed by Fox. So we're not talking about the president's severest critics here. And the question he was asked was, don't you think these tariffs are a good thing? Because the government will get more money when the goods come in. And he said, well, all I can tell you is that I've got a truck that sold for $50,000. Now I have to charge $70,000. Do you think anyone's going to buy my truck? Let me answer that for you, he said. No one. No one's interested in our trucks. What am I supposed to do?
Yeah. Well, yeah, but because no one in government is interested about that man, I assume it was a man, selling his truck, because it is all about how do you extract as much wealth from the population as possible. That's what this administration is clearly all about. That's why they're reducing government spending, because it allows more scope for private consumption from the wealthiest in society. We need to stop looking at it, and I'm sure this will happen in the next 6 or 12 months, but people will stop looking at this from an economic perspective and just see the crime that is going on and not trying to justify it by any kind of neoclassical understanding or a misunderstanding. It's got nothing to do with economics.
So the likelihood is, as you say, that inflation will increase.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident inflation will rise, but that's economics. There might be other things that the government is able to do. It's such a huge economy that it might be supported in various different ways. But at its core, if you increase, and someone says in the comments there, if a tariff is just an amount of money. It's a transfer from the non-government sector, which is me and you, to the government. That's what a taxation is. Sorry, that's what a tariff is. If you pay it, fine. If the dollars are owned by someone who lives in another country and they pay it, fine. But an increase in tariffs is just simply destroying wealth within the non-government sector. So a possible massive recession and huge price inflation. And this is all happening without even the tiniest bit of mainstream economic scrutiny. It's absolutely shocking.
Why do you think that is?
Well, we kind of touched on it at the start, because the narrative that's given is still this idea that the government spending is really bad and it should all be about private consumption. The whole narrative is a neoclassical, liberal, individualist narrative. So it's unlikely, and I haven't seen any people yet who are willing from that world to step out and say, you're completely misusing our understanding, because effectively, it's still in support of an establishment. But I'm sure it's got to happen at some time, because I mean, one of the Federal Reserve banks, America, I think there's about 15, as well as the reserve banks and state reserve banks. But one of them predicted a 3% fall in GDP in the next quarter. So there are some organizations who are saying this is clearly a disaster, not just waiting to happen, but happening already.
What do you think will happen to the smart money when they see this happening?
It'll leave the dollar. I mean, almost without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, the dollar at the moment, I think on the when Trump came to power, I think you could get about 83 or $0.83 for the pound. I think it's down to 0.78 now for the pound. So the dollar's falling and will continue to fall. People will move their money out, and not just purely for economic reasons, but you've got to believe in the state of law in a country. And you've got to believe that the government is trying to do the best for its society, because if it doesn't, there's going to be a revolution or some form of rebellion. So I think a lot of people will be looking to put their money elsewhere, and it's possible that the dollar will lose its global hegemony. Maybe not in the next 6 months, but very possibly in the next few years. I mean,
the BRICS have talked about their own currency.
Yeah, and these things tend to be demand driven. If people are looking for returns on investment, they're not going to buy dollar assets. They're going to buy assets in other countries. So you don't even really need someone to supplant the dollar. It's just that all the other currencies might become a little bit stronger. The dollar is worth so much more because there's so much demand for it as a financial asset. It's got nothing to do with the real resources in that country, and that just means it has a lot of potential to fall in value, because there's just a trust in the American system that backs it, and right now that's completely lacking. John, I don't know if you saw that question about JERS. There's a few people.
Yeah, I was coming to that. Do you want to take it? So tell us why JERS is such a mess. What should we do?
Yeah, I mean, JERS isn't great, but JERS isn't terrible. So I think we have to shy away from this idea that all the figures in JERS are terrible. So JERS is a Government Expenditure Revenue Scotland. It's a form of accounting that was set up initially in the late 90s. And it shows Scotland's fiscal position, its fiscal balance, how much it spends and how much it receives. It's based on, like any report, it's based on a certain set of assumptions. You can change those assumptions, you get different figures, but overall, it shows that Scotland receives more. The UK government, Scottish government, local government spends more money in Scotland than it receives in revenue. That's basically the big thing that comes out of it. There's little debate about that at all. the figure it normally comes up with, which is about 10%, that the government spends more than 10% more than it collects in taxes. Probably round about that. There just really shouldn't be a huge debate about it. It's a set of figures. It's reasonable. All figures like this are, to an extent, are a guess and an element. There's a lot worse, but there's also a lot better. The one peculiarity about it, for some reason, is that it takes one of our biggest exports, which is oil and gas, and slices that out. And all the figures in GERS say, well, this is what it is without oil and gas. And some of the figures say, this is what it is for oil and gas. Now, no other set of accounts for any country on the planet shifts out one major export. It doesn't make any economic sense, but it makes political sense, because it's there to show that if Scotland doesn't have oil and gas revenue, then it's not really going to be able to function. That's kind of what it was supposed to. It was supposed to show.
Are there any numbers anywhere that account for the oil and gas?
Yeah. So it shows. I think the fiscal deficit sits at about 10% in GERS. If it includes oil and gas, it sits about 9%. The GDP of Scotland, I think, is around about 200 billion. Without oil and gas, I think it's 216-ish, 220 if with oil and gas. So they're not huge figures. It's just really peculiar, because some years that figure's much bigger, some years it's much smaller. So just my point, GERS is not great. It would be great if we had something much better, but it is what it is, and it's unlikely to be that far off as an estimate of what happened right now. And that's the really important point, is that GERS just talks about revenue and expenditure in Scotland as it is at the moment.
Do you believe that Scotland is running at a deficit?
Yes, without a shadow of a doubt. Almost all countries run at a deficit. So there's nothing peculiar. I would imagine that Scotland's deficit isn't far off the percentage that they say in GERS. It's very difficult to know for definite, but we've got a report coming out in March, which is going to show how you move away from this position, if this is a position we are at the moment. So if Scotland does have a 10% deficit, so the government collects 10% less than it spends every year, then if we become an independent country, how do we get to a point where we spending only 3%, which is the figure that the European Union would ask us to do? We've got a report that talks about that process and how you would do that. But yeah, most countries, the UK's got a deficit, so it's likely that Scotland has a deficit. But the really important point I want to make, John, is that the system of the United Kingdom is designed for the countries outside of, and the regions and the countries outside of London to run a deficit. That's how the system is designed. It would be something bordering on the incredible if any region outside London ran a surplus, because that's the way the system is designed. That's the way the economy's been designed, possibly for the last 250 years, but certainly since the early 1980s. The UK system is designed for London and the southeast and little bits around the country to make GDP contributions from financial services. And that money was supposed to be made in London, which sucked in all the resources from the rest of the countries, the rest of the regions. All the resources were there, and they could prioritize and professionalize certain sectors. It would make all the GDP, and then the rest of the regions would get some money back. That's the system that the UK was built on. So we're here arguing that isn't it terrible that Scotland's got a deficit, or Wales has got a deficit, or Northern Ireland's got a deficit. That's how the system's designed. And we need to understand that. We're kind of justifying, we'll make a profit, but the system's not designed like that. That's how the UK was being set up. So of course, Scotland's going to have a deficit. But, I argue very strongly that every single nation needs a government to run a deficit, probably a bigger deficit, as we have to deal with the impending ecological crisis that we've got. There's nothing bad about having a government deficit, because that is a surplus of the non-government sector, which is me and you and everyone watching.
The interesting thing too is that maybe you can speak to this for a second. That when I watch news broadcasts from the US, there's generally at some point when there's an economic issue has arisen, some reporter will stand in Times Square and point up at the rising deficit above him on this huge screen and say things like, "This is why we're all going to the hell in a handcart. You see this? See the way it's ticking over here? That's the most damning statistic of all," they will say. Why is that nonsense?
Yeah. Is that the national debt clock you're talking about? Yeah. Stephanie Kelton who's a modern monetary theory economist. She wrote the New York Times bestseller, The Deficit Myth. She said, all we should do is change the name of that to the national savings clock. And then everyone would feel much better about it. But that's what government debt is. Government debt is just the amount of money that the government has created and spent into the economy that it hasn't taxed yet. And that's important. It hasn't taxed yet. So the bigger the debt, the more money in the economy. And if that economy can handle that amount of money and it's not causing inflation, then there's no problem with having the government debt as high as that. It is simply just a scorecard. It's the amount of, it's like the amount of plants in your garden. Doesn't matter. The amount of runs that a cricket team scores or a football team scores, it doesn't matter. It's just an account. It's how much money the government has spent and it's not taxed it back yet. That is it. But without that spending, then people don't have a secure form of savings. So in America, as in most countries, there's a decision being made that when the government wants to spend more money than it collects in taxes, it has to borrow it. So it goes to financial markets and said, today we want to spend an extra 1 billion. Will you exchange? And I don't want to go too detailed here, so I'm going to try and say it in as layman terms as possible. We haven't collected. We've spent 10 billion and we've only collected 9 billion in tax. So we've got a 1 billion deficit. So we're going to go to the wealthiest in society and say, can we exchange this 1 billion pounds in cash for 1 billion pounds worth in bonds? And we will give you more interest on your bonds than the cash that you hold. That's all that happens. So that amount is simply the amount of bonds that are held in the American and external, if the ownership, but held in America, of government debt. That's all it is. It's the nation's savings, and interest is paid to the wealthiest in society for those bonds. So there is no issue with the government debt being. There's no such thing as high, low. It doesn't work like that. It's simply the amount of money, and we all know the economy needs money. The economy needs money to be created from somewhere for it to function. My final point on this is you've got two options. You've got banks who create money and they earn a lot of interest on that money, and you're in debt when you borrow that money, or the government creates that money through government spending and it pays your salaries or it pays for the construction of a bridge. So we want more public money and less private money. But if you're wealthy and if you have shares in financial services organizations, if you've got money to lend, you want more private money and less public money. This is the whole rationale that the mainstream economic profession supports, because it supports the already wealthy. That's why they hate deficits. That's why they rile against it so much, because public money, when it's spent, doesn't to the same extent support the wealthy as private money does. So it's just a huge myth. It's a huge scare story. And this comes back to one of our themes, John. We need to start telling better stories so that people realize this. If you created pounds, right, John? If you created pounds, would you go and borrow some? It just makes no sense. If you're the person who creates apples, right? If you've got an orchard and you can make as many apples as possible, would you go over to your neighbor and borrow apples? Of course you wouldn't. You've got as many apples as you want. But that's the system that we've got. The government borrows because it rewards the already wealthy. The system's right. This is how it's designed. And you can see that all these scare stories are designed to keep us scared. It's us that need more public money.
So the government manipulates society in a number of ways. One is through taxation, and the other is through the stories it tells.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then once in a while, it
I
all
think-
breaks down when you have to find money for COVID, Ukraine, or FDR and the New Deal. They just conjure up the money. They just print it.
Yeah,
Off they go and spend it.
but I'd rather use the establishment rather than the government.
Yeah.
People who are in positions of power, they know that how short-term our memory is. They know they can do this. They can do this because in 2 years' time we'll have forgotten about it. Yeah. And also the establishment has created a society where we're too busy doing other stuff. And there's also a legal framework that stops us protesting. So this is all designed. They think they can just look. This is no better example than what's happening at the States. They've just got so much power. So much power has been eroded from the ordinary people that they can just get away with whatever they want. Our government's doing it right now, telling the poorest, the most unfortunate in society, that it's them that have to step up with a cut in welfare to allow us to arm a foreign country. And whether you think that's right or wrong is, for me, beside the point. The idea that the poorest in society have to pay for it is clearly a situation that most people can see is complete false.
This may be linked to these points you've just made, which are exceptionally helpful. Why is Trump so enthusiastic about crypto?
Yeah, because it's a kleptocracy, and if you have private, I mean, he's got his own cryptocurrency. Yeah. If you want to bribe the president, you don't need to send them dollars anymore. You just go into a digital wallet and you buy £100,000 worth of, I think it's either his or his wife's Bitcoin. But again, we could do a whole episode on Bitcoin. But this is exactly where it is to move away from public money to private money, because private money, there's profit to be made from private money. There isn't profit or anywhere near the same extent to be made from public money. And if America goes crypto, if people who would speak about Scottish independence and using crypto, all this does is take away the fundamental reason to have a currency, and the society collapses. You need to have a currency. There needs to be tax for people to find value in it and to use it. And everything that Trump's doing, again, remember, John, it's nothing to do with economics. It's all about theft, criminal theft. There's a plutocracy, and we need to be aware of that and make sure that it does not happen here.
So in that case, would Trump be insulated from any collapse in the dollar?
I've got no idea what his
crypto. I mean, if his resources are in crypto and the dollar collapses, he's not going to suffer from that, is he?
Well, I mean, it really depends on the extent of the collapse of the dollar. But when you've got huge amounts of power, you've got huge amounts. When you've got huge amounts of wealth, you've got huge amounts of power. And I think the more important question is what's happening with all of that power. But the dollar, I'm not going to suggest that the dollar will be worthless. But in 4 or 5 years, it might be worth a lot less. But interestingly, when a currency is worth a lot less, you're able to buy things for a lot cheaper. And this is one of the reasons why the currency in Argentina, certain people support it to be low, because it allows them to buy lots of stuff with the American dollar in the denominated currency. So these are huge questions, huge issues. I don't think Trump's going to be around long enough to really see the collapse that he's causing.
You think not?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, he's an old man now, and I think these things are going to show in the next couple of years. But if we're going as far as suggesting societal collapse, I don't think he'll be around for that.
I don't think so. But the troubling thing about that is that guess who his vice president is?
Yeah, exactly. These are all
J.D. Vance.
Yeah, these are systemic. These are systemic
Oh
issues.
my word!
You can only stretch a population so far, and I think it's going to become clear that the American people have elected a criminal and someone who's stealing. And I'm sorry if we've spent too much time discussing America, because it's hugely frustrating, because, as I said, these are things that are not really solid economic arguments, because they're so far from what people would expect to be happening, or able really even to understand. It's so extreme.
Well, let's return to the real world. Let's talk about the Festival of Economics, if we can, in closing. If people want to join online, how do they do that? They just is there a website and do it?
Yeah, sure. Just go to our Scotonomics website, click on the link there. We've got an event taking place in Leith just before, on the Thursday, and then we have the conference, the festival, on the Friday and the Saturday. Yeah. It's £20 to attend online. All the sessions that aren't broadcast live, there's about 4 or 5, because we've got things happening at the same time. There's about 4 or 5 sessions that aren't broadcast live, but they're all being recorded. So anyone who joins online will be able to interact. And we've got someone looking for questions and asking their audience, and also doing polls. So it'll be interactive online. And then afterwards, you'll be able to see all of the sessions if you missed any, or if you want to see them again for about 3 months. For about 3 months. So loads, you won't miss anything. And there's a lot going on. So it's a good idea to know that you can step away and come back, and a bit later you can watch the content again.
And if folks wanted to support the work that you're doing, how do they do that?
Well, we've got a Patreon site where you can pay a couple of quid a month to help us with our policy work. And at the moment, the money that we've collected from the festival and also from our patron has gone to commission Dr. Dirk Ince to write a report, and we're hopefully going to do another couple. We've got a big event coming up in June, which is to try and create a bunch of policies that are just going to be lying around for when Scotland either becomes independent, or when we realise that we have to do our economy completely differently. That's another big project for us. But really, if you're interested in the content and you can afford 20 quid, get the online access. It would be great if you could join us in person. And but spread the stuff that we're doing. I think that's really, that's why we're doing it. We need to educate as many people as possible that there is an alternative. For a lot of people, that alternative is independence, but for a lot of other people, the alternative is just having a better understanding of our economy. And I think that understanding crosses both those groups. So we're really keen to inform and educate as many people as possible.
And in terms of informing and educating, what contact have you had with the Scottish Government?
Yeah, well, I've got good relationships with the Scottish Government. Ivan McKee's speaking, and we're having a debate about what a future Scottish economy would look like in our event in Leith. I've had meetings with a few other MSPs. I think they're more open to some of the stuff that we are saying, especially around resilience, than they have been in the past. The Green Party are very open to this, but I think Civic and Civil Scotland is much more open to this. So hopefully more people who understand how the economy really works and can pressure their policymakers, and then the more chance we've got of success. But yeah, we're trying to go top and we're trying to go bottom. John, I'd love to finish just showing the audience the little video that we've got.
Yes, please do.
It goes to
a minute and a half.
Well, that's good, because it's a minute and a half. Well, thanks so much, John. I've really enjoyed that. I'll play this video and then I'll let Kevin decide how to end the show.
Okay. Thanks again, William. Yeah, folks, sign up right now. Okay, we're out of time. Thanks again, William. All power to your arm, and I hope you get a great turnout and lots of people online as well.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks. Bye for now.
All the best. Take care. Good night, all.